Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on the impacts of the energy crisis on Southeast Asia, perspective on Indonesia and Malaysia. This webinar is jointly organized by the Regional Economic Studies Program and the Climate Change in Southeast Asia Program. And my name is Siwage Dharma Negara. I'm Principal Fellow and Co-Coordinator of the Indonesia Studies Program at ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute. It is my pleasure to serve as moderator for today's discussion. Over the past few years, energy has become the center of economic and geopolitical discussion worldwide. The disruption following the Russia-Ukraine war and the tension in the Middle East and persistent volatility in global energy markets have highlighted a fundamental challenge facing many countries: how to ensure energy security while keeping affordability, competitiveness, and climate goals. Many countries in Southeast Asia remain dependent on fossil fuels to power economic growth. At the same time, the region is also one of the world's most dynamic markets for renewable energy investment. Recent energy shocks have tested the resilience of national energy systems. It exposed vulnerabilities in fuel imports dependence and forced governments to reassess policies on subsidies, energy diversification, and industrial development strategy. Indonesia and Malaysia provide especially interesting case studies. Both countries are major energy producers and exporters. Yet, both have also faced difficult policy choices in balancing energy affordability, fiscal sustainability, and long-term decarbonization targets. The two countries provide fuel subsidies to help cushion households and businesses from global price shocks. But the current energy crisis has raised questions about fiscal costs, investment risks, and the progress of energy transition. Against this backdrop, today's webinar will look at how recent energy crises are reshaping energy policy and economic development in Southeast Asia. We will explore both immediate impacts and long-term implications for energy security, renewable energy deployment, and regional cooperation. Importantly, we will also consider whether the current environment is slowing the energy transition or paradoxically creating stronger incentives for accelerating it. To help us unpack these issues, we are fortunate to have three distinguished experts joining us today. Let me introduce our speakers. Our first speaker, Dr. Alloysius Joko Purwanto. He is a senior energy economist at the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia, or IREA. Prior to joining IREA, he worked in Belgium as a researcher in private company in energy, mobility, and transportation fields, and then he joined the energy unit of the European Commission Joint Research Center in Spain. In IREA, Dr. Joko has been involved in studies related to the mobility and transport sector, development of new energy and fuels, critical minerals, as well as the preparation of energy outlooks of East Asian countries. Dr. Joko obtained his master and doctoral degrees in transport economics in France and his civil engineering degree from University of Indonesia. Our second speaker, Mr. Putra Adhiguna, is the co-managing director of Energy Shift Institute, an energy finance think tank focused on Asia energy transition. He has spent nearly 2 decades in leadership roles across the energy sector, previously leading Asia technology research at the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis. He advises policymakers, industry stakeholders, and financial institutions across the region on power sector decarbonization, critical minerals, and clean energy finance. Mr. Putra has served on the Technology and Innovation Advisory Board at the International Energy Agency. He holds an engineering degree from Bandung Institute of Technology and master's in public policy from the London School of Economics. Our third speaker, Professor Leong Yuen Yoong, She's the Director of Sustainability Studies at the UN Sustainable Development Solution Network, Asia headquarters. And she is also Professor of Practice at Sunway University. She co-leads landmark initiatives such as the ASEAN Green Future and Science Panel for Borneo to help inform regional policy and national strategy. Beyond her academic and policy roles, Prof. Leong is an experienced independent non-executive director, providing strategic oversight and risk management for public listed companies. She holds a PhD in International Manufacturing Strategy and Network System from the University of Cambridge, as well as a Master in Electrical and Electronic Engineering from Imperial College London. Before we start, a few housekeeping notes. Each panelist will speak for about 20 minutes. After that, we have a Q&A session. And if you have a question, please use the Q&A function to post your question. And please include your name and affiliation so that we can address you properly during the discussion. And if you encounter technical issues, please alert our technical team through the chat function. So without further ado, let me now invite Dr. Joko to begin the presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Siwage, and good morning all. Yes, thank you so much for having invited me to this. I think this is very interesting webinar and very timely to discuss about the issue of energy crisis and how ASEAN countries have been experiencing and also have been reacting to this. I will start my slide, share my slide from my side, and yeah. Sorry. Can you see my slide?
Can you put it in the full screen mode, Pak?
Okay, just. Okay, now it's good?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, I will start then. Yeah, thank you so much. Can you see my screen?
Yes, but actually you still not displaying the full screen mode.
Okay. I suppose this is good now.
Now it's good.
Yes. Okay. Again, thank you for having invited me. So I would like to deliver to you some key messages that in my institutes of research, so Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia area, which is based in Jakarta, we have been monitoring and we have been observing since the beginning of the crisis. So this presentation would like to start with a very important proposition for all of you. That is, the current energy crisis and the long-term energy transition should not be treated as two different or like distinct policy conversations. In ASEAN, they are deeply connected, and we see that the same structural weaknesses that make the region vulnerable to today's shocks caused by the crisis in Iran, such as market structure, high import dependence, concentrated supply routes, and weak regional coordination, are also the same weakness that the region could slow down the region path toward the carbon neutrality. So the purpose of this discussion now that I am presenting is not simply to describe the crisis or like the impact of the crisis, but I would like also to showing you how a crisis can become a strategic turning point for the region. So then I tried to divide the discussion in three topics. So the first I would like to explain the short-term barriers. That means how the Hormuz disruption exposed our region structural vulnerabilities. And secondly, I would like to shift to the long-term pathway that show how carbon neutrality in ASEAN is in fact possible, but only at a very large scale and with a significant system complexity. And finally, I would like to bring the discussion together into an integrated agenda, meaning that short-term resilience and long-term transition must be designed as one strategic package, not as two different layers of policy. Yes, this is just to recap what we have been observing. So this show how Strait of Hormuz matters so much to ASEAN, and the closure disrupted around like 20 million barrels per day of crude oil supply. This has pushed Brent oil price to around 115 USD per barrel. And yeah, most strikingly, it also pushed the OPEC basket prices nearly to 150 USD per barrel. And we see also that this has affected around 20% of LNG supply, as well as other materials, which is very important for the industry, that is naphtha. And this means that the shock was never only about oil prices. It was a multi-channel shock affecting fuels, petrochemicals, fertilizers, logistics, and industrial production all at once. So on top of that, around 80% of Hormuz oil flows to Asia. And that means that Asia uh, bears the largest share of the system-wide stress. For the Southeast Asia region especially, this is very serious because around 60% of the region oil import come from the Middle East. And the region is also projected, based on several references, to become net liquid natural gas importer by next year, 2027. So, in other words, our region, ASEAN, is not exposed only to a temporary commodity price spike. It is exposed to broader external dependency problem. That is why the economic effect move very quickly from higher fuel price and also like energy resource scarcity into exchange rate pressures, capital outflow, difficulty to invest, uh, and then inflation, difficulty also to maintain production, export, difficulty to maintain the consumption rate, which all the best ingredients to decelerate the GDP growth. So the key message here is that Hormuz is not just a distant geopolitical event. It is a direct stress test for the ASEAN energy system and architecture. So yeah, this is also like how exposed are the region, how exposed are its of the country. So it is very important that we understand how ASEAN countries are not equally exposed. So the region faces a common shock, but each country enters that shock from very different starting point. For example, here just two illustration from the point of view of crude oil and natural gas. The Philippines was the most exposed with more than 90% of import coming from the or like going through the strait, followed by Vietnam at more than 60%, Singapore at more than 50%, Thailand, and also Malaysia. Indonesia's exposure is somehow lower at around 9-10%. And we see that some countries like Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar, they have zero import from of crude, but it doesn't mean that they are not exposed. Indeed, they are very exposed because they don't have or they have very little capacity of refinery. So they are in fact very dependent on the refined products from other ASEAN countries or from outside ASEAN. And it is about the same story when we talk about natural gas. Singapore has had like 15% next exposure, Thailand 11, and Philippines 8%. While several other shows limited or no direct exposure in this natural gas perspective. The point is that vulnerability is not uniform, and resilience cannot be considered only or judged only by the number of stockpile days. It is dependent on domestic production, import structure, availability of alternative fuel mix, the capacity of refinery, and also the ability to substitute quickly, whether it is like resources or is it like the origin of imports. So when ASEAN discuss regional resilience, it cannot assume one size fits all solutions. It must be designed differentiated based on the national condition. But it also need to move within a coordinated regional framework. So this is just one point that I would like to bring up. It is the market structure, which is one of the key transmission variable of the crisis. So we see that in ASEAN energy market there are several types or like groups of market type, like liberalized market, and then single buyer market where there is kind of a pass-through managed by the government or like a one single entity, and then also like state-controlled or monopolized highly administrated market. So like some example is that Singapore, the Philippines, in terms of fuel, they are very liberalized. Thailand and Malaysia, they implement a single buyer system. And state control is known being implemented by Indonesia, Brunei, Cambodia, Myanmar. And then how the shock is transmitted in the liberalized market link or liberalized or market link, we can see that international price pass through quickly into domestic fuel and energy prices directly to the user. In the second uh, single buyer market, prices are adjusted through formula tariff reviews and some stabilization funds. In the state-controlled situation or monopolized, government suppress the delay, the pass-through, so that through subsidy, control, and rationing. And we can see that, of course, in the liberalized market, the fluctuation of prices at the final user phase or level has been quite strong. And then it is less strong, of course, in the state-controlled situation. Both are the same case for gasoline and also electricity price changes. But what is important is the main impact channel. So for the liberalized market, consumers and commodities inflation absorb the shock directly. But this means that there is less burden for the budget. There is less burden for the state budget, and also like the behavior of final users are likely reflect more on the situation of price market. On the other extreme, in the state-controlled or monopolized market, shock shift to budget pressure, utility losses, a shortage or rationing happen. Of course, final users are much more protected, but in the compensation, like state budget, is much more under pressure. So yes, we also see some how countries are reacting differently. Like Indonesia, they have been keeping or maintaining the subsidy for most of the for some products of gasoline and diesel, and then they accelerate also the P50 biodiesel mandate earlier. Malaysia also about the same as Indonesia. They expanded the uh, the amount of oil fund to subsidize the final users of gasoline and diesel. And they put also some supply measures of fertilizers. In the Philippines, national energy emergency have been activated uh, to stabilize price. And then some cargo of emergency crude supply have been secured from Japan. And then maximization of coal power plant utilization rate have been increased. And there have been also some shortage in efficient fuel, and this has disrupted some flights in Thailand. Uh, Control over LNG spot market and also LNG cargo have been activated, and also like the refined products of the country has been controlled to meet first the domestic and then to reduce much more on the export of refined products. The same as in Vietnam. They also have been suspended fuel tax and then much more increasing the refinery utilization for domestic use. So we can see also that beyond these countries like Cambodia and Laos, for example, who had like a very low capacity of refinery, they have been deviating their import of refined products to other countries such as Singapore. And beyond this, we also record or like can observe in the newspaper how fishermen or like how business have been affected quite drastically by the crisis. So yes, this is the the three vulnerabilities of the crisis that have been exposed by the recent Iran crisis. So the first vulnerability is the high dependence of fossil fuel imports in ASEAN. Like 80% of Southeast Asia rising energy demand has been met by fossil fuels. And this means that when external disruption occurs, the impact is transmitted immediately into the domestic system. The second is the concentration of import origins. Around 60% of ASEAN oil imports came from the Middle East. And then the third vulnerability is the underdeveloped regional coordination in terms of APSA and the emergency response system for the oil and petroleum products uh, availability for the country during the crisis. And we also note that the Trans-ASEAN gas pipeline still rely deeply on bilateral arrangements. So a multi-country, multi-fuel shock of this scale, it has revealed the limits of the current energy system architecture. So, however, we see also that ASEAN carbon neutral pathway is still there, and it is still possible to reach the carbon neutrality targets. And but however, as I mentioned previously, the scale and complexity of the transition is big. Learning from the crisis, we should be able to consider or like to take action much more or to accelerate the renewable penetration. Of course, to some extent now, investment in renewable has been impacted, perhaps not in terms of quantitative or like nominal value of the investment, but in terms of, for example, the pathway or like the aspect of the renewable that governments start to put more attention. For example, like in Indonesia, they put what they can do as the earliest phase or accelerate the measures. For example, in the penetration of the use of biodiesel, that they accelerate now to July instead of next year, as well as government has also stated several much more ambitious roadmap for bioethanol penetration, as well as for the renewable solar PV targets. And to achieve the carbon neutrality, then power demand in ASEAN, this is just an illustration from the area energy outlook that we published last month. We see that electrification is one of the things that we should do because it's increased the energy efficiency. And by electrification, to be able to reach carbon neutrality, at least ASEAN power generation should increase by more than fivefold toward the long-term horizon as illustrated here, 2060. The renewable reaching 36% of the shares. And then we will see also that natural gas will still be, we can expect that natural gas will still be playing a very important role in this scenario from area outlook. Like 30% of the shares of the 2060 power generation will still be related to natural gas. That means that related means that the co-firing with hydrogen or with the carbon capture and storage will need to be put forward, while the use of pure natural gas will reach down to 1% only. And then, of course, uh, having this co-firing, having biomass, having also nuclear in the configuration should bridge the gap between having much more stable renewable in the future and much more secure energy system during the transition. So this is one of the most strategic slides in the deck. So it argues that the short-term crisis and the long-term transition are two expressions of the same underlying problem. So in short term, import dependence shows up supply shock and price spikes. In the long term, even as the transition progresses, exposure does not disappear immediately because natural gas remains central for decades. Likewise, concentration of supply origin is dangerous today because Middle East disruption affects refinery and power system, but it also remains a concern tomorrow or in the long term because LNG demand will stay high under the transition pathways that I have shown previously. And finally, weak regional coordination hurts immediate crisis response, and it also threatens the long-term build-up of ASEAN power grid, cross-border uh, trade of biofuels, cross-border trade of hydrogen, uh, corridor of carbon capture and storage, and so on. So we need not only to deal with the problem nationally, but we need also to move together, to move as a bloc, as a region. So yeah, the response can be summarized in this short-term and structural measures. Short-term means that we need to have like a coal backstop much more efficiently, need to build biomass and biofuel, including trade intra-ASEAN or like ASEAN with other regions, South-South collaboration, to reduce fuel demand and end-use efficiency. Deployment of EV is important, reducing diesel demand in the islands, such as in Indonesia and the Philippines, or gas in the Philippines, elaborating specific solutions for household, like clean cooking stove and so on, to operationalize APSA and strategic reserve oil stockpiling in the region. For the short and mid-term is the key measures. While for the long term, we need to diversify long-term procurement, so to expand oil and energy sourcing to not only from Middle East, but of course to other world regions, to accelerate and scale up Asian power grid and trans-ASEAN gas pipelines, and then of course to have regional and legal institutional framework for the cross-border CCS, hydrogen trade, biofuel, biomass trades, multilateral hub development, and to accelerate the penetration of renewable storage, and as a backup, like flexibility system backup is we need to have nuclear develop in the region. So this is the conclusion. The crisis have made very clear that energy security and decarbonization are not separate agenda. ASEAN has the renewable potential, gas, and also like CCS resources and growing industrial base to pursue more resilient energy future. Short term and long term are most effective when they design as one agenda. Just to finish, so these are like the most recent area publication. So we have just published our energy outlook and the saving potential in East Asia, and we have issue paper like policy brief on the Iran war crisis, and also we have been also tasked by President of the Philippines, which is the chair of the ASEAN chairmanship this year, to work on the oil stockpiling to strengthen oil and gas stockpiling system in ASEAN. I finish here my presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Pak Joko, for providing a regional perspective on how recent energy crises are affecting Southeast Asia and what this means for region's energy transition. I think I just would like to remind our audience, if you have any question for the presenter, you can start posting your question in the Q&A box, and then we will try to address your question during the Q&A. So now let me invite Pak Putra to share the Indonesian perspective.
Good morning, Pak Siwage and colleagues. Thank you very much for the invitation. Please let me know if you can see the slide.
Yes,
while I'm
you
sharing.
can see your slide.
Yes, thank you again for all the colleagues at ICS and everyone that's attending today. It's great to be here with, Dr. Siwage, Dr. Joko, and Professor Leong Yuen Yoong. Today, I'm going to bring a little bit closer to country level discussion. Dr. Joko already outlined quite a detailed explanation on how the Hormuz crisis goes and impact Asia and Southeast Asia for more specifically. And I'm going to go a little bit into Indonesia. And I guess for a lot of us, this is really the question that ripples in our mind, right? How do you manage the largest global energy crisis when the oil price is still hovering up and down? We can discuss this on the discussion later on, but we're seeing that there's a lot of moving factors influencing things, from China dropping oil imports, US increasing export, and so forth. But ultimately, it really comes down to the country level discussions. You know, how reliant is it on import? Like Dr. Joko is already outlining, what does the pricing look like? We see that different countries are responding differently with this crisis. At Energy Shift Institute, we're a think tank that look at Southeast Asia's energy transition. And one of the things that we are also interested is to see what kind of pathways will be shaped up by the crisis in the near term. Let me go to the next slide. On Indonesia, let's drop into Indonesia. This is basically, whenever we talk about energy, we need to start broad about what is the main energy structure look like. In oil production, Indonesia has been on a structural decline for 20 plus years. It is the major importer in ASEAN, obviously as one of the biggest countries in the region. In the gas side, it's really at a plateau stage. It was previously a big exporter, and now it's shifting a lot of its gas production toward demand domestically. It is also facing a risk of becoming a net gas importer in the coming decade. And lastly, as known as the coal king by some people, Indonesia's production in energy system in the coal side is very prominent. Now, what chart that you're looking at in front of you is basically in terms of the energy content, the terajoule of annual production. You can see that Indonesia, as the world's largest coal exporter, is producing significant amount of coal. About 60% of it is being exported. As we know, that the coal financing and interest in coal investment is changing as the world is shifting away with the climate targets that is rolled out globally. Now, ultimately, the question for all Southeast Asian countries is to really start with this production side. Because if you're a government official sitting in your palace and your ministries, you'll be thinking about your production side. What does our country produce? What does it demand? And what does the projection look like? And each country will run differently. And you can see here that the case for Indonesia is a bit different than many other ASEAN countries. We see that many other countries are importing many parts in oil as well as coal, while Indonesia is a big exporter of coal. It is just as important for each country to ask where's the global capital is heading to. We're seeing that within the last 2 years, based on IEA's global investment report, that the investment in fossil fuel has been overtaken by the clean energy, which means that the capital is also moving away from a lot of the investment in the fossil fuel traditional sectors. And ultimately, we do know that globally, we're seeing a lot of reduction in energy costs within the renewables, which means that all these three giant energy sources will need to compete head-on with the renewable sources within the region and within each country. We have seen several good analysis about energy securities, and Dr. Joko already highlighted earlier. I just like to emphasize this point in Indonesia's context. This is basically the energy usage in select Asian countries. On the left side is the supply, and the right side is about the net import. You can see that the Indonesian side, as we can probably imagine, it is a big exporter, which means it is very secure in terms of coal production. For everything else, it's basically not secure so much. It's a big importer of oil and so forth. It is important to highlight that whenever we talk about energy security, for the most part, there's still a distinct sections between the oil, gas, and coal, and as well as the renewables, because we can't really combine all 2 or 3 analysis into a single point. We've seen some analysis that shows that overall, as a country, this country is secure. Well, the problem is you can't use coal within your vehicles and so forth. So there's really that differentiations when we talk about analyzing the energy security side. In summary, Indonesia is very secure in coal production. But as we know, the shifting of the market is also starting to happen. About 60% of Indonesia's export goes to 2 countries, China and India. Now, the right side chart from Ember is actually very interesting for countries like Indonesia, because global electricity demand growth is being overtaken by clean energy, which means that even as a country that is secure in coal production and export, it is facing a future that is changing. Now, just briefly within the clean energy capacity, you're looking at select countries, 5 of the major countries in Southeast Asia. You can see the high, uptake in Vietnam, Malaysia, and so forth. We can see that in Indonesia, the uptake of clean energy is still quite slow, which is quite modest. You can see that the green line is still a small sliver up there, which means that there is still a lot of challenges, but at the same time, there's a lot of opportunities moving forward. Now, I'm going to focus more on this broad lens about Indonesia and the calculus, and also going to try to look into the displacement of the oil sector as well as the power sector briefly. On the left side, broadly speaking, Indonesia's reliance on the Hormuz crisis is quite limited as an exposure. Roughly 20 to 25% of supplies of oil and LPG comes from Hormuz, which means that a big chunk of its supply is still secure in other places, whether it comes from Africa, United States, and other countries as well. So price is a crucial early determinant for countries like Indonesia, because in contrast to Philippines that import roughly 90 to 98% of its crude from the Middle East, Indonesia is a bit more secure on that side. However, it's still, in terms of quantity basis, it's still a big importer of oil and LPG. So it remains a persistent economic and fiscal risk. Dr. Joko briefly mentioned about the subsidies. Subsidies is a big factor within Indonesia's energy system, whether you're talking about the oil side, the fuel side, the LPG side, as well as the electricity side. So we're seeing the different pattern that is emerging within Southeast Asia. In times where countries such as China is even limiting the increase in fuel price, Indonesia also done the same to even the greater degree. There's only 1 or 2 small events of increase in fuel price happening in Indonesia within the last 3 months, which means that energy subsidies, i.e. the state budget, is the primary buffer of the crisis so far. So we're only seeing some increase within the premium non-subsidized fuel, but the subsidized fuel at the gas station is actually remain strongly subsidized, with the government and the state oil companies taking the burden of it. Now, the government does acknowledge a shifting capital trend. Dr. Joko outlined how there's a global rush toward transitioning, and the Indonesian government does acknowledge that, and that can be seen on some of the actions and the public statement that it has made. The last point, however, it is also important that when you talk about power sector, which is intertwined with clean energy, Indonesia is still a country that is still having the luxury of imposing a domestic coal price cap. In effect, it's basically another layer of subsidies on top of the state budget. Now, this means that whenever we talk about the clean transition, we do need to look at things more holistically, from the transport, the LPGs, as well as the power sector. So these are in very simplified terms if the domestic calculus of how Indonesia likely see the Hormuz crisis. There has been several reactions happening within the last 2 to 3 months. The president announced an acceleration of its goal of imposing 100 gigawatt of solar panels, which is very welcome because Indonesia has been slow in developing the clean energy, as you can see in prior slides. So this plan is still in progress. It remains an open question. There's still a bit of a push and pull about who's going to do it, whether it's going to be the state utility, it's going to be a village level project or a bigger level project. So we're trying to see where this is going to lead to. But it shows a good intention that there is an acknowledgement that the capital is shifting globally. Now, secondly, there is an energy transition acceleration task force, which is also formed and led by the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources. It tried to lead the transition process. Now, on the left side, you can see that I did put a remark that transition can mean many things, and I'll explore that within the next few moments. And lastly, there is a weighing again of the EV incentive, which has been going back and forth in Indonesia, because coming back to the earlier point, the key risk for the crisis is really in oil and LPG imports, and oil means transport for a big degree. Now, let's look at the displacing imported oil, because it really sits very high on the government priority list. Essentially, what we're looking at is a push and pull of EV adoption push on the one side and biofuel scale up on the other side. Today, Indonesia's biodiesel is at about 40 to 50% blending, and bioethanol is planned to go 5% or even higher for gasoline. Now, to be fair, biofuel is able to scale up very rapidly, but it comes at its own cost. And on the right side, I'm going to try to unpack that a little bit. So the domestic energy narrative or the energy security is really something that each country will need to look at transparently and credibly, because every time we make a decision, it does come with its own cost. Now, biofuels typically doesn't come cheap, which means that on a typical market, it can be 20 to 30% more expensive than your regular fuel. In Indonesia, we impose domestic cross subsidies, basically funding the biodiesel subsidies with the export of the palm oil. That amount to about $2 to $3 billion per annum. And this amount seems to be reaching a ceiling because the amount of biodiesel that can be exported as palm oil or those that can be used domestically has its limit, because ultimately you will be faced with the productivity limits of what Indonesia can produce. Because if you want to expand, that means you will need to likely do more deforestations. Now, lastly on biodiesel is that the biodiesel, actually, when people talk about food versus fuel, it is already happening in Indonesia in 2023. Because by that year, the amount of domestic biodiesel already exceeded the domestic food consumption, which means that when there's many concerns going globally, whether it's in the US, Brazil, and so forth, big countries with big biofuel use will definitely face this limit, and that limit has already been reached in Indonesia in recent years. So what are the alternatives? The EVs is definitely a more economic alternative, but the incentives have been going in and out. On a positive note, sales of EV has reached about 13 to 15% of our car sales right now. It remains to be seen what's the latest statistics that are going to come. Now, the clear economic winner of EV that we can see in many countries is indeed clouded by the subsidized fuel, because roughly 80 to 90% of Indonesia's fuel on the road is being subsidized, which means that you have the distortion of economics. So in other words, yes, there will need to be some additional government support on things like infrastructure for charging, which has limited budget. Now, at the same time, you're trying to balance that out with the amount that you're spending on subsidized fuel. Now, lastly, right now, the attention on the two-wheelers seems to be still quite limited. There's still quite a few projects and initiatives that are ongoing, but in our views, much more attention is definitely needed. If we recall China's first uptake of electric vehicles, the leader has been started with the two-wheelers and the three-wheeler segment, because the important caveat here is that those segments are the biggest user, one of the biggest user of the subsidized fuel, which means that if you're trying to shift budgets from the subsidies into the electrics, you will definitely want to aim for those that are using the subsidized fuel, because you get the wins on the both sides of the arguments. On biofuel, however, this is the risk that all countries also need to pay attention. Right now, there is an ongoing discussion about energy security in Southeast Asia. We're seeing several countries also pursuing a lot of the biofuel path. As I mentioned briefly earlier, to be fair, biofuel is able to scale up much more significantly sometimes in certain countries. But we also need to make very careful assessment. How much does it cost? What kind of ability for each country to produce biofuel without impinging a lot of deforestation in such areas? We can see that earlier when I mentioned that the food versus fuel is already there, which means that for Indonesia, the risk of deforestation remains very elevated. And this is something that the country will need to consider very carefully when they talk about energy security. Now, briefly on power sector, you can see the map on the right side from Bloomberg NEF that shows the cheapest electricity source across many countries. This is a few years old, but the roughly picture, I think, remains quite the same. We can see that in many countries, solar and wind, which is indicated by the yellow and the blue, is some of the cheapest energy globally. Now, we can see in countries like Indonesia, however, it still remains cheap because you have the domestic coal price cap. As we can see that in the world that is changing, the country also needs to make a lot of political decisions. I underline the word political because when your power system is basically dominated by a single company, which is a state-owned enterprise, a lot of the decisions will likely remain political, not just pure economics. with the world that is changing, the capital that is shifting, it is due time for countries like Indonesia to revisit how it approached its power system. Now, the good news is that for the near future, for the next 10 years, this is basically Indonesia's plan. We're seeing much more increase in attention, as you can see earlier, with the president initiative of the solar power. Indonesia's plan to roughly about 76% of its state utility capacity build out in clean energy, which can be outlined within the different segments here. Now, PLN also targets what they call a gigawatt procurement, which is a major procurement, probably one of the largest within PLN history within renewables within the last 1.5 months. So it is very refreshing to actually see a gigawatt scale procurement plan coming from the state utility. So I think this is also a good response toward the long-term plan as well as the energy crisis. Now, this is a few closing slides from our side. We at ESI, we do a lot of research to look at the coal's hold on Indonesia's mindset. Because when people talk about the coal transition, the natural attention goes into coal power. While if you're talking the world's biggest coal exporting country, the coal money and politics is centered within the mining sector. It's not within the coal power. So it is very important that whenever we want to talk about a transitioning world, we do need to approach it through across different lenses. You can see here that the coal sector within the yellow mark here is actually the single most profitable non-banking sector within the country's publicly listed sector. So we look at 700 different companies and we find this yellow bar there, which means that it has a lot of capacity to drive investment, diversification in energies and other sectors as well. On the right side, you can see two news that are emerging within the last 2 months. Firstly, Indonesia tried to control a lot of its commodity exports, which caused a lot of ripples within the last few months. And within the last few weeks, actually, there is quite an interesting news is that there is a lot of blackout that is happening in several of Indonesia's electricity region due to shortage of coal supply. So what happened is that whenever the coal price globally increase, because you have a domestic coal price cap, a lot of producer has the incentive to export it, creating a lot of shortages within the domestic market. So the transition signal for Indonesia is starting to emerging, but it does need to kind of sieve out how will it direct its existing power system, which is supported by this coal domestic price, as well as the future of its power system, which will be invested a lot within the clean energy side. And in closing, whenever we talk about energy security, and I think Dr. Joko already outlined this as well, is that within a lot of Asian region, energy security and energy transition is actually quite intertwined. A lot of people tend to look at, let's do energy security first, and then we do the transition. But within the world that is shifting, when the capital market is also changing, these two are not mutually exclusive. You can't do one and do the other in a sequential progress. You actually need to kind of intertwine to both, because we do know with the region, countries like Indonesia, and a lot of other countries in Southeast Asia, if you're importing a lot of oil, a lot of gas, and a lot of coal, you do need to exhaustively explore your clean energy pathways. It is also important that each country tread carefully to avoid high-cost energy pathways. High cost can mean many things. It can mean high cost of imported LNG. It can mean high cost of environment if you do a lot of deforestations and many other things. So every decision within the energy sector, within Indonesia and broader Southeast Asia comes with its own cost. So it's important that these will need to be fleshed out credibly and transparently. So that's all my presentation, highlighting a bit of Indonesia, and I'll return it to Dr. Siwage. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pak Putra, for your very insightful presentation on the impact of energy crisis on Indonesia, energy security and transition. Finally, let me now invite Professor Leong to discuss the Malaysian experience and outlook.
Thank you, Dr. Siwage, for your introduction. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Although we are separated by screens today, I hope that over the next 20 minutes, our time together will be more than intellectual exchange of data. What I want to share with you today is a systemic perspective born out of a deep commitment to the green future of ASEAN. To truly diagnose the impacts of the global energy crisis on Malaysia, this presentation moves past standard linear assumptions. Instead, we used the advanced power sector modeling developed under the ASEAN Green Future Project as an empirical foundation to analyze the sharp structural trade-offs of the transition across 3 distinct chapters. Part 1, from fiscal friction to sovereign strike. This will be an examination of the false dam effect, unpacking the structural friction between Malaysia's incoming carbon tax and its entrenched natural gas subsidies. Part 2 will be a deep dive where we will talk about the Malaysian Shock Plus stress test. And this is a techno-economic evaluation of grid resilience under compounded geopolitical and supply chain constraints. And we also map out the non-linear valley of vulnerability. And part 3, we'll talk about the regional carbon architectures and administrative customization. And this will be a comparative analysis of how ASEAN neighbors are adapting carbon pricing as a mechanism for fiscal self-defense against the EU Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism breach. In transition literature, carbon pricing is often treated as a first best instrument entering a frictionless market. In reality, a carbon tax enters a complex, pre-existing ecosystem of historical subsidies, market distortions, and entrenched political compromises. Malaysia serves as a classic bellwether. As a middle-income, fossil fuel-rich ASEAN member state, it has designed a landmark carbon tax slated to launch at ringgit Malaysia 35 to 45 per tonne for hard-to-abate sectors. Yet, its power sector remains anchored to a de facto natural gas subsidy embedded in a 2-tier pricing system. So, attempting to deploy a carbon tax while maintaining this structural subsidy is the economic equivalent of pressing the brake and the accelerator at the same time. The market signal that is intended by the tax is systematically muffled by artificially underpriced gas. We call this structural friction the false dam, meaning that it is a fiscal architecture that appears to manage energy flow, but actually obstructs market reality. The operational mechanics are clear. There is a subsidized Tier 1 gas price capped at 35 ringgit per MMBTU, running against a market-linked Tier 2 benchmark at 46 ringgit per MMBTU. So this 11 ringgit distortion translates into an implicit annual subsidy of approximately 3.2 billion ringgit, or 805 million US dollars. And this creates a massive fiscal weight that holds back market reality. Instead of dissolving this distortion, Malaysia's National Energy Transition Roadmap projects its long-term expansion, with gas capacity slated to grow 46% from 19 gigawatts to 28 gigawatts by 2050. So the false dam is not merely being preserved, it is being actively reinforced. By stripping this distortion away in our modeling, we establish the exact break-even threshold where the carbon tax signal finally outcompetes the subsidy. And that threshold is $11 US per ton of CO2 equivalent. Now, because Malaysia's proposed compliance carbon tax was slated to start at roughly $8 to $10 US per ton of CO2 equivalent, this is mathematically designed to lose from day one. And the state would have been deploying this counterbalancing fiscal instruments that neutralize each other and ensuring that the fossil fuel status quo prevails beneath a veneer of climate action. So the ultimate geopolitical validation of this model occurred when the Minister of Natural Resources and Environmental Sustainability officially deferred the implementation of the carbon tax timeline. So the state explicitly cited the Middle East energy volatility and the risk of compounding consumer burdens as the drivers of this delay. Now, this deferment empirically proves our core thesis, which is a resilient compliance carbon architecture cannot be overlaid onto unaddressed structural fossil subsidies. During a global energy crunch, the unmitigated gas distortion ensures that any carbon price signal risk an immediate politically volatile pass-through to the consumer price index. Now, when caught in this friction, macroeconomic pressures will always force the state to prioritize short-term price stability via the false dam. And this ultimately sacrifices the structural readiness required to survive the next systemic crisis. We now move beyond the standard cost optimization. A major gap in transition literature is the absence of techno-economic stress testing under extreme geopolitical constraints. To address this, we subjected our Malaysian power sector model to a shock plus test across 3 horizons, 2026, 2035, and 2050. We tested 2 policy architectures. One is the Optimized Existing Policy, OEP, which follows the Malaysia's National Energy Transition Roadmap. It preserves the gas baseload. The second is the Optimized, More Ambitious Policy, which is designed by researchers. And this one accelerates decarbonization through a carbon tax. Now, the shock itself is dual and compounded. It is a 3 times gas price spike, mirroring the 2022 Japan-Korea market marker, which surged to $54 US per MMBTU, plus a 50% physical supply constraint, simulating the maritime choke point blockage or pipeline failure. Now, crucially, we constrained the model's perfect foresight. The system must absorb disruption using existing fixed capacities, and it cannot re-optimize its infrastructure reactively. So this tests real-world operational resilience, not theoretical flexibility. Now, the results validate that deep decarbonization is a vital national security infrastructure, and it is not just an environmental policy. So under the optimized existing policy scenario, the 2050 shock yields catastrophic failure. Look at the red boxes. There will be a 93% surge in unit electricity cost and 45 terawatt hours of unserved load. And that is approximately 10% of Malaysia's national demand. So we see that the gas-dependent system, when it is subsidized in normal times, it collapses when its physical supply foundation is disrupted. Conversely, we look at the optimized, more ambitious policy scenario. It demonstrates energy sovereignty's resilience by 2050. Look at the blue boxes. It will yield 0% cost delta and zero unserved load by effectively decoupling the grid from global gas price volatility. But the model reveals a critical, not obvious insight, which is sovereign immunity is not linear. Between 2026 and 2035, the optimized, more ambitious policy scenario enters a valley of vulnerability. Look at the green boxes. During this window, unserved load and cost temporarily exceed the baseline because the legacy fossil baseload is retired before renewable capacity and grid-scale storage achieve critical mass. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is not a flaw in OMAP, but a governance imperative. So navigating this valley requires tactical channel management rather than structural obstruction. The state must actively maintain strategic gas reserves, demand response capability, and regional interconnection as mandatory bridged infrastructure. The false dam and the shock plus together tell a single story. That is, fossil subsidies, it purchases price stability, but it cannot purchase operational resilience. When the crisis comes, the subsidized system fails and the decarbonized system survives, but only if the transition is managed with eyes open to this non-linear valley of vulnerability. In June last year, the Malaysian government structurally overhauled the electricity tariff system, replacing the lagging 6-month imbalance cost pass-through ICPT with a highly responsive monthly automatic fuel adjustment, AFA mechanism. The true systemic vulnerability of this architecture was exposed when the AFA rate turned positive for the first time, hitting 1.38 cent per kilowatt hour last month and rapidly climbing to 2.59 cent per kilowatt hour this month. This surcharge was driven not just by international fuel markets, but also by localized operational failures. There was simultaneous unavailability of 2 major coal power plants and critically low leak levels at the Temenggor and Kernier hydroelectric dams. So these forced an immediate and expensive reliance on marginal gas generation. So this operational crunch has provided empirical validation of our shock plus stress testing framework. Rather than a theoretical hazard, the recent AFA surge functions as a real-time manifestation of a compounded shock. When climate-driven hydro capacities dropped and coal baseload stumbled, the grid's structural overdependence on natural gas instantly penalized the domestic economy. To prevent this volatility from destabilizing the consumer price index, the state was forced to deploy its emergency fiscal buffers, injecting 91 million ringgit from the Kumpulan Wang Industri Electric Fund to partially absorb the spike. Now, this intervention perfectly illustrates the systemic drain on state reserves required to artificially sustain price stability when structural grid resilience fails. The Energy Commission in Malaysia has fundamentally overhauled the domestic renewable energy framework. It has sunset the legacy net energy metering scheme and launched the Solar Accelerated Transition Action Program, Solar ATAP, earlier this year, alongside the third edition of the Corporate Renewable Energy Supply Scheme, PRES. So by moving away from rigid quotas and fixed one-to-one credit offers, Solar ATAP permits flexible sizing up to 100% of maximum demand, while transitioning non-domestic export compensation to a dynamic market-driven system marginal price. Now, the significance of this is that by tying compensation directly to real-time market prices, this regulatory pivot represents the active, practical management of the mid-transitioned valley of vulnerability. Recognizing that the grid cannot sustain an unbridled influx of intermittent, unfirmed solar without threatening grid homeostasis, the state initially attempted a heavy cost shifting strategy, which is to introduce a sweeping battery energy storage mandate down to 72 kilowatt peak and aggressive standby charges to force developers to absorb the grid firming cost. The final guidelines, however, demonstrate a sophisticated recalibration between expansion and systemic constraint. By restricting BESS and standby thresholds strictly to macro-scale installations exceeding 1 megawatt AC, the state has struck a tactical compromise. So this mechanism, it shields medium-scale commercial adopters from prohibitive capital expenditure while reinforcing strict technical guardrails on massive utility-scale injectors. So the underlying principle here is clear. Rather than choking off private capital through overregulation, the state is strategically channeling it to build resilience where it matters most. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this delicate balance is not unique just for Malaysia. It points to a broader geopolitical reality accelerating across ASEAN, where increasing energy vulnerabilities force states to leverage their regulatory and fiscal policies to protect their domestic architectures. So, if Malaysia's national grid requires such careful legislative hedging to survive a supply shock, how are its neighbors designing its own structural defenses? This brings us directly to part 3 about regional carbon architectures and administrative customization. As we know, across ASEAN, carbon pricing is accelerating, but it is arriving at wildly different speeds. What we are witnessing is a masterclass in administrative customization, where each state is meticulously tailoring its carbon architecture to match its own unique political economy, institutional capacity, and exposure to international trade. Singapore was the regional pioneer. It is currently executing one of the most aggressive economic-wide carbon tax in the world, scaling from 25 Sing dollars today towards 50 to 80 Sing dollars by 2030. And a dual threshold system is applied. That means 2,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent for reporting and 25,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent for taxation. And this covers 80% of national emissions, and it is backed by stringent third-party audits. So Singapore has a high integrity, high capacity governance framework. Malaysia employs what we call the 7-inch strike, which is a precise, limited regulatory blow. Rather than expanding administrative capacity across the entire economy, it targets the iron, steel, and energy sectors. These are the highest emitting blocks, whilst minimizing the macroeconomic drag. It is the sovereign strike translated from fiscal to regulatory space. Now we look at Indonesia. Indonesia manages the region's most complex architecture, which is a hybrid cap, tax, and trade model with intensity-based emissions ceiling per megawatt hour. Now, this reflects a global shift. China, India, and Indonesia now lead the world's largest carbon pricing systems, all intensity-based, and this prioritizes carbon efficiency and industrial scaling over absolute production caps. So, ladies and gentlemen, when we look at this regional map, we see a profound divergence in fiscal sovereignty. Singapore can hold the line on an aggressive pricing trajectory towards 50 to 80 Sing dollars by 2030 because this country possesses the fiscal insulation to absorb consumer shocks directly via mechanisms such as USAVE utility rebates. Conversely, Malaysia's recent deferment of its compliance tax, driven by the Middle East volatility and cost of living concerns, demonstrates the reality of acute structural exposure. Lacking that same fiscal insulation, Malaysia is forced into a tactical retreat to protect its domestic baseline. So ultimately, this proves that in the real world, the pace of clean energy transition is fundamentally bound by a state's fiscal capacity to endure the shockwaves of global volatility. But this retreat cannot last forever because of the impending reality at the European ports. With Malaysia's immediate industrial export exposure to the EU CBAM sitting at nearly €1 billion and potentially tripling if chemicals are included, domestic carbon pricing remains an economic necessity. The CBAM breach is designed to keep tax revenues within national borders rather than let them bleed to Brussels as tariffs. Malaysia's delay is a temporary pause to survive the immediate macroeconomic crunch. But the encroaching architecture of global trade means that the state must eventually cross that bridge or face severe industrial penalties abroad. So ultimately, the impacts of the energy crisis on Malaysia and the broader ASEAN region reveal that a successful energy transition is not just a technical challenge of deploying renewables, but a profound exercise in macro fiscal defense. Achieving absolute energy sovereignty by 2050 requires policymakers to first dismantle the false dam of structural fossil fuel subsidies, which will muffle carbon price signals and drain emergency fiscal buffers like the Kumpulan Wang Industry Electric Fund during supply shocks. Second, the states must navigate the non-linear valley of vulnerability during the mid-transition phase. And doing this by using tactical channel management, such as the Solar Atap framework, to strategically balance private capital expansion against rigid grid constraints through dedicated grid firming and energy storage. Finally, countries must cross the CBAM bridge. While macroeconomic exposure may force tactical delays to shield consumers, international trade architectures mean compliance carbon frameworks are no longer optional environmental policies, but these are mandatory instruments of fiscal self-defense to keep revenues within sovereign borders. For ASEAN, the true metric of success is in moving past structural obstruction to master strategic guidance. It is the channeling of the inevitable flows of global energy volatility to preserve macroeconomic homeostasis. Back to you, Dr. Siwage.
Thank you very much, Professor Leong, for your insightful and comprehensive presentation on the energy situation and challenges in Malaysia. Now we will open the floor for question. We have received so many questions from the audience, and yeah, I think maybe we need to extend our webinar for a few minutes in order to cover some of this very important question. And I think Pak Joko and Pak Putra have actively answered some of the question in the Q&A box. So I will try to read the question that have not been answered yet by Pak Joko and Pak Putra. Her question is that both Malaysia B15 mandate and Indonesia B50 ambitions were accelerated by the current oil price shock. But biodiesel margins in both countries have historically depended on the price spread between palm oil and fossil diesel. What structural changes would need to be in place for these mandates to hold when oil prices fall back? Maybe Prof. Leong and also Pak Putra and Pak Joko can share your insight on this question. Prof. Leong, do you want to start first?
Okay, I will try. I wonder if having a designated percentage of palm oil production designated for biodiesel could work in these two countries. So that would actually provide a stable, it would actually contribute to the stability of the biodiesel industry rather than leaving it to the fluctuating price gaps between palm oil and fossil fuels. So this could be a country's a strategic step to actually provide a stable base for its biodiesel industry to grow. And that there are multiple benefits from that. Not just in using up spare palm oil, shoring up palm oil prices when it's falling, but there are just the decarbonization benefits, energy security benefits. So I think the state needs to look at these things in a holistic manner and put in place the structural changes to ensure that these holistic benefits can be sustained rather than leave it to market volatility.
Yeah, if I can add,
Yeah.
thank a little bit.
Putra?
I think the answer from Prof. Young already quite detailed, and I think that's basically the approach that many countries are trying to do. In Indonesia, we also try to do the same, basically doing an export levy for, palm oil as a biodiesel base, and then try to use that money to subsidize. I do believe it is doable to a certain limit. I think the lessons coming from countries like Indonesia is that there will be a ceiling to that, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to balance how much revenue can you get on one hand, whether it's export levy based, and how much are you going to spend on the other. The problem is that once you hit that ceiling, and I do believe that Indonesia hit that ceiling about 18 months ago, because it basically slashed half of the subsidized biodiesel, it will be difficult. So again, ultimately, the point from Prof. Yoong is very valid. I think it's really about using the production commodities revenue to subsidize it, but you will hit a ceiling. Now, at what point that ceiling will come, that's a question that each country will need to answer. Thank you.
Okay, next question. So with the fiscal burden from Budi fuel subsidies in Malaysia rising from 700 million ringgit to upwards of 7 or 8 billion per annum, which is likely unsustainable, how does the government justify the new diesel subsidy inclusion in peninsular Malaysia beginning on July 1st? Maybe Prof. Leong, you can answer this question.
I think it's not about justification. I think the government is doing pain management. There are pains in different segments of society, and this diesel subsidy is needed by the industrial and commercial sector. So that keep the economy rolling. Otherwise, the economic contraction will aggravate very quickly. So I think it's pain management. The long-term vision for this is actually for all these subsidies to be gradually removed, and to move towards more energy resilience. So currently, this is a stopgap pain management phase.
Thank you, Prof. So next question, maybe Pak Joko can answer this question. What role could the ASEAN Power Grid initiative play in addressing the energy crisis in our region?
Yes, thank you so much. So yeah, it is a way that ASEAN is working forward, and actually, the ASEAN countries are dealing with the how to have a harmonized market systems to support the development of ASEAN power grid, and we hope that this kind of power grid that will connect Mekong countries as well as Indonesia, Singapore, up to Borneo and the Philippines will play a role in securing more electricity supply for its country, and it's will be able also to like motivate or like give some more stimulation for countries with a high potential to produce renewable electricity to the system, and therefore it's supposed to help providing security in this power supply as well as in transitioning toward more low carbon electricity. Of course, then the market system or mechanism need to be agreed at the first place, and therefore like each of the country participating on the APG should see like the what will be the social welfare that they will get by having this APG implemented not only in terms of physical infrastructure, but mostly as kind of a regional multilateral market of electricity.
Okay, actually there are other related questions with regard to the ASEAN Power Grid. Would the domestic challenges to ensuring energy security and power resilience means a reluctance to embark on electricity exports and supporting the interconnection necessary to establish the ASEAN Power Grid? And then another question, I think Pak Joko, you mentioned that there's a need for open regional trade in bioenergy as a condition for future security and decarbonization. So can you elaborate further on this?
Oh yes, I will. Yes, for the first one related to APG, as I mentioned, like, this really touch like the country sovereignty I mean, like, for the moment, like the perspective of each country will be like, yeah, we have resources, we have, I don't know, coal, we have renewable, or we have gas. We need to supply first, to cater first for the domestic, our domestic demand, and yeah, why should we export it abroad? And again, this is back to the thing that I mentioned previously. The perspective in this regard should be like, what will be the welfare that each of the country will benefit from this APG. One, we understand that the welfare will be there, like at the different level, like from the country level, regional level, going down to the user level. Then APG it should be like the win-win solution and like win-win agreement for all. And secondly, about the bioenergy trade, what we see is that, yeah, of course, there is like a biomass or bioenergy or biofuel. They're like regional or like country specific. And for the moment, there is no framework of the trade between ASEAN countries, so intra-ASEAN. For example, like Indonesia has a very big capacity to produce biodiesel based on CPO as well as Malaysia. On the other hand, Indonesia need to have much more bioethanol. And in the meantime, in parallel, Thailand, they have a big capacity to produce bioethanol from cassava as well from molasses, but they need more biodiesel. Why don't we have a kind of, let's say, trade between Indonesia and Thailand? Indonesia can export its a CPO-based biodiesel to Thailand. On the other hand, Thailand can also support export bioethanol to Indonesia. And I guess this need to be opened up, like it is one of the bottleneck of the bioenergy trade in the region. And I believe that if we can come up with, yeah, like, well, of course, this is not a matter of energy, this is a matter of trade, this is a matter of flow of commodities between countries. We need to work on that framework that allow this kind of things to happen. And this is not perhaps only in the bioenergy, but also like to other energy-related materials. Thank you.
Can I
Thank
add
you.
something to the
Yes,
APG?
Prof.
Yeah, I think there is a difference in the thinking level. I think countries have been used to thinking about national sovereignty. And that is one of the reasons why the ASEAN power grid has been moving along slowly. And for it to actually to accelerate, I think we need a different thinking paradigm, which is moving from national sovereignty to regional sovereignty. So if we shift levels of thinking, then all these trade-offs, my benefit versus your benefit, it changes. And we get into the mindset where we are more likely to find an arrangement where it is win-win for all the parties involved. And if we can do this during times of peace and stability, that will prepare us to be more resilient during times of crisis. During times of crisis, there is no space for this kind of more holistic thinking. People usually think more about self-preservation.
Yeah, thank you, Prof. There are more questions for you actually. In July 2025, Malaysia government has reformed the electricity tariff, whereby introducing automatic fuel adjustment, reflecting consumers' monthly bill. How does the action supports the dismantling the false dam, referring to the KWIE? And then the next question also for Prof. Leong is that you mentioned homeostasis, yeah, a few times. So is this trying to maintain the status quo the best strategy for managing a transition? How should Malaysian government take advantage of these changes? So repeated fossil fuels plus ever dropping electro-tech costs and growing data center power demands.
Let me try. I think introducing the AFA is a separate matter from dismantling the false dam. Introducing the AFA is actually shifting the burden towards the consumer. Let the consumer feel what is happening in the market. And that could hopefully have an impact on shifting consumer behavior, making consumers, the lay people, actually more sensitive, more aware of what's happening in the market, and knowing that your behavioral changes in your electricity usage can impact your electricity bill. So that is one kind of action. Removing the false dam is actually about removing the subsidies towards the natural gas that is being fed towards natural gas power plants. So that is at the chain where power is generated. So here we are seeing actions on different parts of the supply chain, of the value chain. So I think both are needed. We need to work on the generation part, making it also reflect market reality. On the consumer part, making consumers more aware of market reality is also a positive step towards greater energy efficiency. Okay. Move on to the second question, the meaning of homeostasis. So I didn't mean homeostasis as maintaining status quo. Homeostasis is a body condition. Our body automatically maintains a temperature at is it 36.9? It's a suitable temperature. Whether we are in a very cold room or we are out in the hot sun, the body adjusts that so that we can continue to function. So whatever new system that we design, whether it's energy system, fiscal policy system, we want it to be able to maintain its homeostasis as well. We don't want it to tip over with any when a shock just happens.
Yes, thank you, Prof. So we are running out of time, but I think let me quickly get some last question. Maybe this is for Pak Putra. I think you already typed your answer, but let me repeat again. This question is very important. I think you mentioned about EV, and the question from Alfian is that asking whether this development of EV incentive will affect the current automotive industry. And then this will also have a significant impact on the labor force in Indonesia. So he is asking whether the promotion of EV can be considered in a holistic way, not just from the energy perspective, but also maybe for overall the economic objective.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Siwage, and thank you for the question. I'll touch base again on the ASEAN regional cooperation later. So broadly, yes, that point is 100% valid. The model of importing 100% Chinese EV that is happening in Africa, Southeast Asia, and many Middle East countries is not a sustainable plan, right? It will be politically fragile, especially if we understand, like in Southeast Asia, you have the Proton, you have the Thailand auto giants, you have the Indonesian market, which means that localizing production is a crucial part of the EV transition. In my view, to get within the first 5 to 10%, you can probably import a lot of that just to kind of get the market rolling. But after you reach that progression, there need to be serious commitment to actually localizing a lot of the domestic production of EVs. Otherwise, it will be politically very fragile because each of these countries are also producing a lot of the auto parts. Now, one other part, I guess, just a brief touch on the ASEAN regional cooperation. We always like to think big when we talk about ASEAN power grid. You know, it's kind of like think big or go home, because if we look at the power system globally, you need to think from east to west, right? From when the sun sets in the west, maybe something can be harvested from the eastern side. So the ASEAN integration is crucial, but it's also crucial to think small, because most likely what will happen is you'll see 1 or 2 countries doing, you know, short-term cooperations for certain years. And secondly, it's also important that countries will need to share the benefits. Let me bring one example. maybe to develop a solar, you can sell it a bit more expensive to Singapore, but it cross-subsidizes your domestic users. And by doing so, you will be able to get the political domestic benefits as well as the export market. So I think when we talk about ASEAN Power Grid, I actually encourage people to actually think small, because I think that is where the politics start to coalesce around building something more regional. So I'll return to you, Dr. Siwage. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Pak Putra. So let me read a few last question, and maybe any of the speaker can share your insight on this. How has the recent geopolitical dynamics affected energy security strategies among Southeast Asian countries? And foreign policy and geopolitical alignment seems to matter more in how well countries, including those in Southeast Asia, could secure energy. Do you agree or not on this? And how can ASEAN enhance regional cooperation on energy security? And yeah, I think we have some framework, but how we can strengthen our ASEAN framework in addressing our regional and energy security. And then the last one, to what extent has the recent energy crisis accelerated or set back energy transition efforts in our region? Maybe Pak Joko first, and then Pak Putra, and then Prof. Leong, the last.
Yes, thank you so much. So I will try to to say some most important elements. So of course the like I agree with Ms. Maria Monica Wiharja that foreign policy and geopolitical alignment seem to play a very important role. And for the moment also this is to touch also like the what is the ASEAN framework on this topic. We have some framework on the security of petroleum, like the APSA framework, where in fact the region should act as a region, as a bloc during the time of crisis to ensure the availability of petroleum at the affordable price. But the thing is that like the implementation level is not that smooth, and countries need to discuss more on this. And perhaps in this time, like I mentioned previously, between the ASEAN leaders, this is a growing awareness of how and how the country, the region should move as a bloc. And for example, in one of the things that we are busy with is preparing the oil stockpiling strategy at the regional level. But this is not only between governments. This is not only about the region dictated or ruled by the government, but more complex it is that this will include also like the private sector's involvement, and private sector's involvement meaning not only private sectors from the ASEAN, but also like the oil companies coming from the Middle East or like other part of the region. So this is a multidimensional and multi-sectoral talks that we need to have. However, we hope that at the region level we can reach some agreement, which will be like the base, like the starting point, a political agreement to move the region toward much more secured energy, but also to get to the transitioning to a low carbon economy. Thank you.
Pak Putra?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Siwage. So firstly, I think we need to understand that ASEAN has limitations. I think we need to live with that. You know, as we know in many cooperation countries, the stockpiling idea is a good one. I think that is something that has been ratified by many countries for a few decades. But we also need to remember that the original plan was back when oil and gas was a big production in ASEAN, which is a very different case on where we are today. Now, such a regional cooperation will be important when you have 2 or 3 countries that are in crisis. But when all 11 countries are in crisis, it's going to be a completely different dynamics, right? So I think we do need to understand what are the limitations to that. Secondly, is also that any kinds of stockpiling or any kinds of pathways will initiate their own cost. And I think that is also important to be transparent and put on the tables what are the options. Here are the costs of ASEAN power grid, here are the costs of domestic, and so forth. And I think we're seeing that in different level of transparency across different markets. And I think there need to be more transparent discussions when we talk about that. Because again, as we talk about regional corporations, that is usually what comes to the fore. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Yeah. Prof. Leong?
Okay, as mentioned by my fellow panelists, there are multiple ASEAN frameworks for enhancing regional energy cooperation. What I would like to add to that is actually on building trust. Like whatever it is, whatever regional infrastructure that we want to build, like before the wires, the interconnectors, I think trust between the people, trust between the countries need to go first before the physical infrastructure will happen. So and trust is not something that is soft, it is something that is very real. And so how do we put structure to it? I think if we could put in more thinking towards that and cultivating, building trust as a competency amongst the various practitioners who are involved in the ASEAN power grid, I think this will build the foundation, enhance the foundation for ASEAN energy cooperation. Back to you, Dr. Siwage.
Okay, thank you, Prof. With that, let me bring our webinar to a close. On behalf of ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute, I would like to extend my sincere thanks to Dr. Joko Purwanto, Mr. Putra Adhiguna, and Professor Leong Yuen Yoong for sharing your valuable insights and expertise with us. I would also like to thank all of the participants for joining us and for contributing thoughtful questions to the discussion. Apologize that we cannot cover all the questions, but we hope that you found today's webinar informative and engaging. And we look forward to welcoming you to our future events. Thank you very much all and have a pleasant day. Thank you.